The smell of expensive cologne and the faint, lingering scent of a woman's floral perfume entered the room before he did. It was a scent that did not belong to me, a scent that had become the hallmark of his frequent business trips. I watched from the shadows of my memory as Julian stepped into our Chicago penthouse, his silhouette framed by the cold, oppressive glow of the city skyline. For years, this glass cage was my world, a place of silent suffering and meticulously polished surfaces that hid the rot underneath. But today, the air was different. The silence was no longer a suffocating blanket. It was a loud, vibrating declaration. He expected the lights to be low and warm. He expected the smell of a home-cooked meal. He expected me to be his shadow, waiting at the door to take his coat and offer a soft, forgiving smile for his long absence. Instead, he walked into a tomb. My name is Sarah, and I am 30 years old. For 7 years, I was the perfect wife to a man who treated my heart like a disposable commodity. I lived in the center of opulence, surrounded by designer furniture and the finest art, yet I was starving for a single drop of genuine honesty. Julian thought our relationship was a game where he held all the high cards, and I was merely a spectator to his life. He was wrong. He was so incredibly wrong. The moment I realized broken trust was beyond repair, I left. I did not scream. I did not throw glass. I simply vanished into the rain, leaving behind the ghost of the woman he thought he owned. It had been 15 days since I walked out of this penthouse with nothing but a single suitcase and my dignity. 15 days of silence that he was only now beginning to hear. Julian tossed his keys onto the ebony side table, the sharp metallic ring echoing through the empty halls. He frowned, his eyes scanning the dark living room. The grand piano, a gift he had bought to silence my complaints about his late nights, sat in the corner, its lid closed and a thin layer of gray dust settling on its polished surface. I used to play that piano every day, but the music had died long before I did. He called out my name, his voice sharp and demanding, filled with the irritation of a man who was used to being served. He complained about the cold, about the lack of dinner, about the eerie darkness. He was convinced I was throwing another one of my petty fits, sulking in the bedroom until he offered a hollow apology or an expensive trinket to smooth things over. He still believed he could buy my forgiveness for his husband's infidelity with a credit card. Martha, our loyal housekeeper who had seen every tear I shed over the last 7 years, emerged from the kitchen. She did not carry a glass of scotch or a tray of appetizers. In her hands was a plain manila envelope, held with a grip that was both firm and trembling. She looked at Julian not with the usual deference, but with a mixture of pity and a cold, hard reproach. She stood in the center of the foyer, a small figure against the backdrop of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian demanded to know where I was, his tone becoming more aggressive as the silence of the house began to grate on his nerves. Martha did not flinch. She simply extended the envelope. She told him that I had been gone for 15 days. She asked him if he had truly forgotten the way he pushed me to the edge, or if he was simply too blinded by his own reflection to notice the wreckage of his marriage. He snatched the envelope from her, his movements frantic and filled with a sudden, sharp anxiety. When he pulled out the documents, his face went deathly pale under the recessed lighting of the hallway. There it was. My signature, neat, firm, and final. The divorce papers were not a request for a conversation. They were a death certificate for the life we had built on lies. He stared at the date, his breath hitching in his throat. 15 days. I'd been gone for over 2 weeks. And he had been so caught up in his secret life, so immersed in his affair, that he had not even noticed the vacuum I left behind. To him, my presence was like the air he breathed, something he took for granted until the room was emptied of oxygen. But the true blow came next. Martha silently placed a heavy black plastic trash bag on the designer rug, an eyesore in the middle of such luxury. She told him that I had left a message. I had said that trash belongs in its proper place and that I no longer had any use for him or the things inside that bag. With trembling hands, Julian reached into the plastic. He pulled out his own wedding ring, the gold band cold and soulless, and then he found it. Tucked at the bottom was my late mother's antique pearl brooch. It was the only heirloom I had left, the one thing I valued more than my own life. It was a symbol of a love that was pure and enduring, everything our marriage was not. Seeing that precious item discarded in a common trash bag was the moment the reality finally shattered his ego. He collapsed onto the sofa, the weight of his betrayal finally crushing his chest. The Chicago skyline continued to twinkle outside, indifferent to the man breaking down in his ivory tower. He realized then that this was not a childish game. I was truly gone. I had treated our relationship, our shared history, and even my most cherished memories as nothing more than refused to be discarded. He sat there in the dark, clutching the divorce papers and the discarded pearls, finally realizing that while he was out celebrating his infidelity, I had already moved on to a life where he no longer existed. The silence of the penthouse was his only companion now, a deafening reminder that once trust is turned to dust, there is no way to build it back. He was a king with no kingdom, a husband with no wife, staring into the abyss of a future he had burned to the ground with his own hands. The Chicago wind howled against the glass panes of our penthouse 3 weeks before the end, a mirror to the storm brewing within the walls I once called home. That was the day Julian shattered the sanctuary of our marriage by bringing her through the front door. Serena, his first love, the one he claimed was the muse of his youth who had finally returned to the city. He did not ask for my permission. He demanded my compassion. He spun a web of lies about her emotional trauma and a string of bad luck overseas, portraying himself as the noble protector of a broken soul. I stood in the foyer, my breath hitching as I watched him guide her to the guest suite with a tenderness he had not shown me in years. In the pocket of my silk robe, my fingers tightly gripped a pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. A secret joy that should have been the foundation of our future was now a terrifying burden. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that our family was finally beginning. But the words died in my throat as he looked right through me. The peak of his cruelty arrived on the evening of the city's most prestigious gala. Serena was preparing for her grand entrance, draped in an emerald gown that screamed for attention. Julian entered our bedroom while I was sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to find the courage to share my news. I looked up at him, my eyes pleading for a single moment of connection. I whispered his name, but he held up a hand to silence me before I could even begin. He did not want to hear my heart. He wanted my jewelry. He demanded my mother's pearl brooch, the heirloom I had protected like a sacred relic since the day she passed away. Those pearls were not just stones. They were the embodiment of her grace and the last tangible connection I had to a love that was unconditional. I had planned to pass them down to my own daughter, a cycle of love that was now being threatened by his callous request. When I refused, the mask of the doting husband fell away, revealing a monster of vanity. He looked at me with a cold, cutting disdain that made the room feel like a freezer. He told me that I spent my days rotting in the library, hidden away like a ghost among dusty pages. He said that if I wore the pearls, they would look like cheap costume jewelry because I had lost my light and my beauty. He insisted that Serena, with her refined aura and musical talent, was the only one worthy of bringing out their true value on such a grand stage. Dealing with a cheating husband is one thing, but seeing him prioritize his affair over my mother's legacy was the final straw. I watched him take the velvet box from my vanity, his eyes filled with a terrifying conviction that I was the one being unreasonable and petty. That moment was the true death of my marriage. It was the absolute erosion of respect, a realization that I was no longer a partner but an obstacle in the path of his new obsession. Husband infidelity is often described as a lapse in judgment, but this was a deliberate desecration of my soul and my history. I stood there in the shadows of our bedroom, my hand resting over my womb, knowing that the child I carried would never call this man father. He had traded 7 years of loyalty for a woman who was a stranger to the sacrifices we had made to build his empire. I did not beg him to stay. I did not fight for the brooch. I simply watched him walk away to pin my mother's legacy onto the chest of his mistress. In the silence that followed, I realized our relationship was a hollow shell. The hope I had carried for a lifetime vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve to burn it all down and start again. I was alone, But for the first time in years, I saw the world with absolute clarity. The pain hit me like a jagged blade in the dark. It was midnight in Chicago, and the sky was weeping a relentless, icy rain that hammered against the glass of our empty penthouse. I was alone on the cold marble floor, clutching my stomach as a terrifying heat began to spread through my lower abdomen. My breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely swipe the screen. I called him. The first call rang until the voicemail clicked in. A hollow recording of Julian's voice that felt like a slap in the face. I did not give up. I could feel the life I carried flickering, a tiny flame fighting against a rising tide of blood and fear. I called a second time, praying for a miracle. When he finally answered, there was no concern in his voice, only a sharp, serrated edge of annoyance. I tried to speak, to tell him that I was losing our baby, that I was terrified and bleeding out on the floor of the home we were supposed to share. But Julian did not let me finish. He barked at me to stop calling, telling me he was at the hospital and was far too busy for my drama. My heart stopped when I heard Serena's whimpering voice in the background, a delicate, practiced sob. Julian told me that Serena had scratched her finger on a rose thorn and that the bleeding was making her lightheaded. He accused me of using a petty tactic for attention, a clumsy performance to ruin his night. He told me to call a taxi if I was truly in pain, and then he severed the line. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a funeral bell. This Reddit relationship story took a dark turn in that moment of absolute abandonment. He chose his mistress over his own unborn child. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, deeper and more lethal than the physical agony tearing through my body. I survived. I pulled myself to the door, called an ambulance, and spent the night in a sterile white room, fighting for the life inside me while my husband tended to a scratch on another woman's hand. When I was discharged, I did not go back. I took what was mine and fled to a small weathered cottage on the coast of Maine where the Atlantic Ocean could drown out the sound of his lies. I spent weeks in the mist, healing my body and my soul. But Julian, driven by a twisted sense of ownership rather than love, eventually tracked me down. He arrived on a gray afternoon, looking disheveled and frantic, standing in my garden like a ghost from a past life. He tried to reach for me, his voice thick with a fake remorse I no longer recognized. Before he could take a single step toward my porch, Olivia, my lawyer and the only person who had seen the true depth of my scars, stepped between us. She did not offer him a seat or a kind word. She held out a thick file, her eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Maine winter. She confronted him right there, amidst the scent of pine and salt. She handed him the ultrasound from that night and the emergency room reports that detailed the trauma his neglect had caused. She told him to look at the timestamps. While he was holding Serena's hand over a nick, I was being wheeled into surgery to save his child. Julian flinched as if she had struck him. He stared at the images of the fetus he had nearly killed with his indifference. The silence that followed was absolute. He realized then that he was not a hero or a victim. He was a monster who had turned his back when it mattered most. I watched from the window, my hand resting on my belly, knowing that he would never touch this child, and he would never touch me again. He was a stranger to the life he had almost destroyed, and his regret was a poison he would have to drink alone. The salt air of my Maine sanctuary was suddenly poisoned by the cloying, synthetic scent of Serena's perfume. She had followed Julian like a predator scenting blood, her desperation manifesting as a manic energy that disrupted the peace I had fought so hard to build. One afternoon, while Julian was clumsily trying to repair a broken fence by the gate, an obvious excuse to linger near me, Serena appeared like a ghost in the mist. She did not come with a white flag. She came with a blade hidden in her smile. She confronted me on the steep wooden stairs of my porch, her eyes blazing with a calculated, venomous fury. She hissed that I was a washed-up ghost using a fake pregnancy to lure back a man who no longer wanted me. I stood my ground, my hand resting protectively over the life growing inside me, my silence a wall she could not breach. The climax of her madness happened in a heartbeat. She saw Julian turning the corner, and her expression shifted from malice to a terrifying, practiced agony. She reached into the pocket of her oversized coat, her fingers frantically squeezing a small plastic bag. With a blood-curdling scream that tore through the quiet afternoon, she threw herself backward. I watched in frozen horror as her body tumbled down the wooden steps, a spray of bright red liquid soaking her white dress and pooling on the gray wood below. Julian dropped his tools and sprinted to her side, his face bloodless. He scooped her up, his eyes snapping to mine with a red-hot, irrational rage. He roared that I was a monster, a murderer who had finally let my jealousy turn into bloodlust. He accused me of pushing a pregnant woman down the stairs, his voice echoing across the rocky shoreline. I did not scream back. I did not plead for him to believe me. I simply pointed to the tiny, blinking red light tucked under the eaves of the roof. I told him that a woman who has been betrayed as often as I have learned to document everything. Every second of her stagecraft had been captured by the security cameras I installed the day I arrived. We moved the chaos to the local clinic, a cramped, sterile building where the smell of antiseptic stripped away the glamour of their lies. Julian stood in the hallway, his shirt stained with the red liquid he believed was the lifeblood of his child. But the truth was waiting in the hands of a weary doctor with 30 years of experience. He emerged from the examination room looking not worried, but disgusted. He tossed a burst plastic bag filled with red food coloring onto the counter and looked Julian directly in the eye. He told him there was no miscarriage because there was never a pregnancy. He revealed the cold, clinical reality. Serena had undergone a permanent tubal ligation 8 years ago. She had been incapable of conceiving a child since long before Julian had welcomed her back into his life. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Julian staggered back, his back hitting the cold, painted wall as the foundation of his new life crumbled into dust. Just as the silence became unbearable, the heavy doors of the clinic swung open. A woman in a tailored wool coat, her eyes as sharp and unforgiving as flint, strode into the room. She did not look at Julian. She looked at the quivering Serena. She was a woman from London, a victim whose husband had been scammed out of $2 million by the woman sitting on the hospital bed. She exposed Serena's entire history, revealing a trail of broken men and emptied bank accounts stretching across Europe. My cheating husband realized too late that his affair was a hollow trap designed to drain his bank account. He traded a diamond for a viper, and now the venom was finally reaching his heart. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic, belated realization, but I was already turning away. I stood by the window, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the iron-bound coast, finally free from the shadow of their shared madness. The viper had been exposed, but the diamond was gone forever. The spotlight felt like a baptism. I stood center stage at the grand concert hall, the wood of my violin pressed against my collarbone like a pulse. For 7 years, Julian had told me I was nothing but a shadow, a ghost in his library, a woman whose light had been extinguished by the mundane chores of his household. But as I drew the bow across the strings, playing the final, haunting notes of my original composition, Song of the Sea, I felt the air in the room shift. The music was not just a melody. It was the sound of a woman rising from the ashes of a burnt life. The video of that night went viral, reaching 10 million views in 48 hours. The world finally saw me, not as the discarded wife of a businessman, but as a force of nature. I had reclaimed my voice, and this time it was louder than his lies. The final showdown at the Chicago divorce court was a cold, clinical execution of the life we once shared. Julian sat across from me, his expensive suit hanging off his gaunt frame. The man who once commanded boardrooms was now drowning in a sea of his own making. Serena, in a final act of venomous spite before her own sentencing, had leaked proof of Julian's long-term tax evasion and his illegal funneling of $2.5 million into overseas accounts to pay off her gambling debts. His reputation was incinerated. The bank moved in to seize the penthouse, the cars, and every cent of his $30 million fortune. He was forced into absolute bankruptcy, stripped of the status he valued more than his own family. When the judge brought down the gavel, the sound echoed like a thunderclap in the silent room. Full custody of our daughter, Daisy, was granted to me. I walked out of that courthouse into the bright, biting Chicago wind, leaving the wreckage behind. Healing after divorce is not easy, but I found peace. I no longer cry for my marriage. I celebrate my rebirth. I realized that the pain was not an end, but a forge. I rebuilt my life from the ground up, one note at a time. I found a man who does not ask me to be a shadow or a servant. Adrian, my conductor, does not just lead the orchestra. He respects the fire in my heart. He looks at me with a warmth that Julian never possessed, a quiet, steady love that is built on truth and shared passion. Together, we raised Daisy in a home filled with music, salt air, and laughter, far away from the toxic luxury of my past life. She is growing up knowing that her mother is a fighter, a woman who chose herself when the world tried to break her. Julian is now a ghost haunting the edges of the city. He works as a dock worker on the frozen Chicago waterfront, his hands calloused and raw from the manual labor he once mocked. Someone told me he stops every time he sees my face on a digital billboard or hears my violin playing on a passing radio. He is haunted by the ghost of my husband, the man he was before he sacrificed a diamond for a handful of ash. Every month, without fail, a bank notification pings on my phone, a child support payment of $500. It is a pittance, a small reminder of the debt he can never truly pay. Julian is now just a stranger who sends a check every month. I do not hate him anymore. Hate is a fire that requires fuel, and I have none left for him. I am whole. I am free. The sky after the storm is finally beautifully clear.